Welcome to Think Governance, where we dive into critical questions in the boardroom and share insights on what makes a board more effective and impactful. Think Governance, empowering leadership, igniting change.
Welcome this evening to the IODSA offices. I see many familiar faces, but I also see many new faces, which is really lovely to see the growth and transformation in our membership over the years. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. For those who don't know me, my name's Pami Natterson, and I'm the CEO of the Institute of Directors. I'm going to introduce you to our guest speaker, who you all braved the Joburg traffic to come and listen to today. Guy Lundy is a seasoned leadership consultant with a deep understanding of the business environment in Africa. He leads Spencer Stuart's business in South Africa, advising clients on executive talent and strategic leadership. He's a respected board member, having served on multiple South African boards, known for his thought leadership in future trends and scenario planning. He's also the author of 2 books about South Africa and its future, and we really look forward to hearing a bit about that in his talk as well. He's presented to audiences in 18 countries. In 2009, when he was the CEO of business leadership organization Accelerate Cape Town, Guy was named one of South Africa's top 100 thinkers by Business Day. So we're very privileged to have him here. He holds degrees in economics and future studies, and he's fluent in English, Afrikaans, and French. So Guy will be unpacking for us the 5 distinct stages in a CEO's tenure and the critical challenges and opportunities in each phase. In addition, he's going to delve into complex global geopolitical landscape that we find ourselves in today, adding a timely and urgent layer to this conversation on leadership. I did say to him when I greeted him when he arrived, I'm keen to see which stage of this CEO journey I am in. So I'm sure I'll get there, but I welcome Guy, and I'm going to hand over to him. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Pami. And thanks to the IOD for having me here as a guest today. It's always a pleasure. I've spoken at a couple of events with the IOD over the years, and it's always great to continue to be involved. So thank you to all of you for being here, and I certainly hope that I'm going to be able to give a bit of insight and share a bit of knowledge that'll be useful to everybody here on this nice chilly Joburg evening. So as you heard, what I'm going to be talking about is the life cycle of a CEO, and the content of this comes from a study that's been done by colleagues of mine at Spencer Stuart in the US, who studied a whole range of CEOs from the Fortune 500 companies over a 20-odd year period in terms of how they performed over time. And the reason for looking at it was because the standard expectation of what we think a CEO is going to do over time and how they're going to perform tends to be a sort of stylized, you start out okay, you're kind of new to the role. How are you going to perform? You'll get a little bit better and a little bit better, and you'll just gradually kind of improve over time. And then as you get a bit long in the tooth, you start to tail off. And so you kind of do this gentle curve towards retirement over a long period of time. So that's the traditional wisdom, and I think it's natural for us to think that that's probably going to be the way that it figures out. But when doing the numbers, our colleagues in the US who did this study found that actually it's not quite like that. And I'll show you when we get to it that it's a much more of an up and down over a period of time. And they're really key drivers that lead to how the performance of a CEO improves or deteriorates over time. So I'll get to that, but as you heard Pami say, I'm going to start out by looking at the context in which CEOs have to operate today. I think it's very important to look at that, because coming into a role, if you're going to stay in that role for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, it's going to be a very different world by the end of your tenure than it is today. than it was at the beginning of your tenure, and particularly with what's going on at the moment. So it helps to kind of get a picture of what is happening and then look at this CEO life cycle within that context. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to take us through a little bit of a journey around what we're doing, where we're at, and where we're likely to end up over the next 10 to 15 or even a slightly longer period. And then I'll come back to the life cycle of a CEO within that context. So what does the world of today and tomorrow look like? I think one of the things to take into account is that volatility is something that's happened over many years. If we look here at this graph, which shows business confidence, this is the RMB BER, Bureau of Economic Research Business Confidence Index, which was started in 1975. And over a 50-year period, this is what it looks like. So what you can see is that back in 1975, things were doing okay. We were quite positive. This line here, by the way, is neutrality. So anything above it is a positive view of business confidence, and anything below it is a negative view of business confidence. So business leaders are saying down here that things are not looking good, and up here they're saying that things are looking good. And what tends to drive this volatility, particularly over a period of time, has been economic or political to a large degree. So if you look here in 1976, this was the June 16th events that kicked off a whole series of riots and unrest in the country over a period of time, which took us down into negative territory. Then in 1980, the gold price shot up to $1,000 an ounce, which of course today seems like nothing, but back then it was a tremendous amount of money. So it took business confidence all the way back up again to positive territory. Then in 1984, we had the Rubicon speech by P.W. Botha. And of course, that took us down into that territory where we had sanctions, financial sanctions against South Africa, etc. And so there was negativity. Then in 1989, 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. The Berlin Wall came down, etc., etc. So as you can see, major events, both local and international, drive a lot of this sort of volatility. If you look in 1995, one of the interesting things, so this was just post-1994, you can see the lead up to 1994 was particularly negative because there was essentially a low-level civil war taking place between the IFP and the ANC in many of the townships around the country. And then we had a successful election, so things started to look up. And in 1995, we had a particularly happy moment because we won the Rugby World Cup. So it does also show you how sort of crazy some of this volatility can be. So there was huge positivity in 1995, and then of course reality set in and it wasn't quite so positive. But we managed to pick it up through to the end of the 1990s. And then the global crisis of the late 1990s in emerging markets, and then through the early 2000s were very positive, right up until 2008. And 2008, business confidence dropped below positive and has been there pretty much ever since. So one of the things that has changed in South Africa particularly has been that there's been a lot less of that positive-negative volatility, and things have remained pretty negative ever since 2008. And if you look internationally, you're going to find the same sort of effect that's taking place over the last 15 years. Since 2008. And I want to have a look at another concept, which is a concept of long waves, to try to explain why some of that might be happening. So within a long period of time, you have much of this volatility that takes place between political incidents, economic effects, etc. But over a longer period of time, you'll see the same thing happening stretched out in different ways. And these are called Kondratiev waves. They're named after a Soviet economist who lived in the 1920s, 30s. And when they had the Wall Street crash in 1929, Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, asked Kondratiev, or ordered Kondratiev, I don't think Stalin ever asked anyone to do anything, ordered him to go and prove that capitalism was dead, because this was an opportunity to show that communism was the only way forward. So Kondratiev went away, as good economists do, and he did his studies. And what he found was that if you looked at it up until that point, there'd essentially been 3 waves of capitalism and economic activity, starting with the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, and you then, off the back of a significant technology, in that case steam power, you see significant growth. It goes through a series of fairly predictable events, and one of those is that Kondratiev talked about a peak war. So the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, the US Civil War or World War I up to that point, which then causes a sort of a downturn, but it picks up again. So if you look in the 1920s, you had the Roaring Twenties, tremendous amounts of money being made, the days of the Great Gatsby, all of that sort of thing, but off very tenuous grounding. And then, of course, in 1929, you had the Great Depression, the Great Crash, which ended up leading to the Second World War in 1939. So you have that sort of, you have these technologies, so steam power, railways, electricity and cars, that drive significant technological growth, advancement. It takes the world through a significant growth period. It has its little downturn, pickup, and then big crash. And you end up at the bottom of a wave. Since Kondratiev, and by the way, poor old Kondratiev, because when he came back after showing that capitalism was not dead, he shortly thereafter was dead. So he was committed to a gulag, and then he was shot at dawn for giving the wrong answer to Stalin. So since his death in the 1930s, there's been a fourth wave, which was driven by the invention of computers after the Second World War. So post sort of 1947, 48, through the 50s, 60s, the great space race, which drove a tremendous amount of technological advancement in computers, we saw huge growth through the 50s, 60s, through to the 70s. The Vietnam War is often considered as a peak war, which led to a downturn in the 70s with the oil crisis. And then through the 80s, 90s, you saw a pickup again, the exuberant 80s, through to around 2004-05, and then the crash back in 2008. So what that suggests is that we are, since 2008, and again, if you go back to this, you can see that we've been sitting at the bottom of a wave. And that's why we tend to feel the kind of uncertainty, the unpredictability, the weirdness that goes on around the world around us, is that we find ourselves at the bottom of a wave. So if we are at the bottom of a wave, what are some of the things that tend to happen during a period at the bottom of a wave? One of them is that you have quite a major social backlash during that period. So you have a backlash against the traditional establishment. And we see this, for example, against banks and against audit firms and against various other organizations that have been seen as being the sort of pillars of our economic stability. So there's a pushback against that. There's also a pushback against the traditional establishment politically. And you can see this in the United States, for example, where they talk about cleaning out the swamp, getting rid of the people that have been running politics for as long as they have, etc. So a real pushback against the traditional establishment that has been running the economy and the world up until that point. Another thing that comes with that is social unrest. And if you look around the world today and for years, over the last sort of 7, 8, 9 years, you can point to multiple examples of where social unrest has boiled over and over again. Again, very common in the period between economic waves. There's also political instability. And you can, again, look around the world, look at places like the United States, places like Brazil, places like the Philippines, places like South Africa, where you've had political instability over a long period of time, again, very common at the bottom of a wave. And then you also have, during this period, an interesting resurgence of independence movements. And we can see this in the UK breaking away from the EU. We can do this better ourselves. And of course, the growth in interest in Scotland breaking away from the UK has also come back to the fore. Similarly in Spain, similarly in Canada, where you've got Quebec that talks about breaking away from Canada. You've got the Canadians who are absolutely desperately not interested in being the 51st state of America because they believe they can do it better than being part of the whole. or in Spain with the resurgence of the Basque separatists, etc. So it's quite common that we see areas within a country and countries that are part of a whole, much like the United States, talking about breaking away from NATO, breaking away from the UN, etc. We can do this better ourselves. So this whole sort of turning inwards and moving away from the global picture is not something that has never happened before. It's not unique. It's something that we can completely expect at a time like today. But one of the other interesting things that happens in this period is that people look to somebody to save them from the situation. And that's why I have pictures down at the bottom there of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. So an interesting stat. The first Marvel Cinematic movie that was made in the modern era was Iron Man. It was made in 2008. And since 2008, they've made 36 superhero movies. Okay, that says something about the psyche of the human mind at a time like we're living through today. 36 superhero movies, and people continue watching them. They keep paying money to watch them because the idea of having somebody that can come and save you from the badness that surrounds you is very appealing. Similarly, that superhero genre was started with a comic. Interestingly, the first superhero was called The Clock. I have no idea why he was called The Clock, but he was created in 1936. So again, it tells you something about the psyche that people were experiencing at the time. Superman was created in 1938, and Batman was created in 1939. So a very interesting thing how people reach to somebody to save them. And it goes a long way to explaining why we have this growth in the strongman politician around the world. So Bolsonaro, Duterte, Trump, Putin, Erdogan, all over the world, we've got these strongmen politicians that have bounced back against democracy and against the confusion that democracy brings because people are turning to somebody to rescue them from the discomfort that they're feeling. Okay, so I find that stuff quite interesting because it explains a lot about why we do the things that we do. So if we are at the bottom of the wave, what's going to drive the next wave? Is there going to be a next wave? And I think that the next wave is going to be driven by a combination of things. The first one is fairly obvious. It's become fairly obvious. It's actually quite interesting. I first put this slide up probably 10 years ago. And at that stage, artificial intelligence, what is artificial intelligence? Suddenly the large language models have hit the public mind, and artificial intelligence has become a big reality to everybody. It's been there for a long time. Artificial intelligence has been in our cars, in our phones, in our TVs, etc. for a long time. We've just never seen it. The difference today, of course, is that we see it all the time. So we're using it constantly. And what that does is that it drives a tremendous amount of productivity growth. And that's essentially what this wave increase is about. It's about an increase in productivity, whether it's steam power, railways, electricity, computers. It's about improving productivity. And artificial intelligence is really about improving our productivity as human beings. Similarly, we've got biotechnology and nanotechnology, two other things that we don't really see very much of, but that have a significant impact on our economy. If you look, for example, at biotechnology, this is a picture of Dolly the sheep. Dolly the sheep was cloned in 1996. So that was nearly 30 years ago. We were able to clone a living being. Okay, and that's biotechnology that's now been going for another 3 decades. So you can only begin to imagine the amount of work that has gone into genetically modifying crops, making them more drought resistant, making them more flood resistant, etc. So again, the ability to produce more food for more people has significantly enhanced. And then you've got nanotechnology, the science of the very, very small. If you pull all of these things together, you have examples like being able to put sensors inside trees to monitor their health, genetically modified trees that produce more fruit, you can tell what they're doing, and you apply artificial intelligence, you're able to tell before the tree gets sick that it's about to get sick, and you can do something about it. So that combination of those three technologies has the ability to really take us to another level in terms of the growth of the wave. Okay, so if the wave is turning positive and we can expect that there will be a growth in productivity, how does that affect us on a global level, given the changes that are taking place at the moment? And I think I'd be remiss not to point out that what's happening is a significant global power shift that's taking place around us today. This is a graph that's put together by Ray Dalio. Some of you might have heard of him. He's a billionaire investor, and he wrote a very interesting book called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. And he and his team did 500 years worth of economic history research, and they looked at the rise and fall of empires over time. The Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the Americans. And what you see is you see a growth period within that leading power globally. And in the early stages, you've got things like strong leadership. You've got inventiveness, coming up with interesting new ways of doing things within that economy. Education is very strong. Strong culture. People are standing together. They're proud of who they are. They believe in what their country stands for. Good resource allocation, competitiveness, income growth, strong markets and financial centers. So that's your growth period that we saw, for example, in the United States around the turn of the last century, 1910, 1920, etc. Then that power gets to the top of that period, and what tends to happen is that the money that gets made starts to get spent in much less productive ways. So it gets spent on things like art, which is great, but it's not going to create productivity. It's not going to create economic activity to the same degree as if you're spending it on machines, on agriculture, etc. So a lot of that also ends up getting paid for by debt. So the economy becomes overextended, becomes increasingly indebted. It starts to lose competitiveness, and there are significant wealth gaps that start to grow because the people that are spending on the less productive stuff are the people that are making more money. The people that are spending less on education, on healthcare, on food, are the ones that can't afford it. So your gap starts to grow. And then you go into the decline phase where that country starts to be under tremendous pressure from debts. The United States, a very good example today, with trillions of dollars in debt. If you look at a country like Spain back in the 1600s, exactly the same thing happened. Huge debts that make it very difficult for that country to maintain their space in the world. They start printing money in order to try and pay for the things that they've got used to enjoying. There's internal conflict that starts to rise within the economy, exactly what we see in the United States today. Loss of reserve currency tends to happen. If you look at what happened from the real in Spain to the guilder in Holland to the pound in Britain to the dollar today, where's the real today? Where's the guilder? Are these reserve currencies? They're not. So to think that the dollar will remain the reserve currency indefinitely is just not looking forward and thinking, where's this going to go to? And you get weak leadership. So in these countries, as the conflict increases, the leadership becomes harder and harder to try and stand behind, and you end up with significant internal conflict, and in many cases, civil war and or revolution. So what he's saying is that what he sees in the United States, and he's American, by the way, what he sees in the United States is that they've been through all of this, and they're in the process of going through a decline. And what tends to happen then is that as that one economy starts to decline, another one starts to rise. Exactly as you saw in the United Kingdom, as they started to decline, the British Empire got smaller and smaller and less relevant. The United States took over, and in that period, you have a change in the world order. And that also tends to coincide with one of these long waves. And that's pretty much what we're seeing around us today. So those are some of the things that we are dealing with. And as much as sometimes it seems obvious, other times we're just so busy with our day that we don't actually look at the bigger picture and realize what's going on around us and the context in which we're operating. A couple of other things to consider looking forward in terms of some of the risks that we face. So this comes from the World Economic Forum, and they look at various types of risks. They look at a 2-year period and a 10-year period. In the 2-year period, some interesting risks coming out. The top risk is misinformation and disinformation. So, telling lies, basically, and getting people to believe it. Extreme weather events, another major risk in the 2-year period. State-based armed conflict. Israel-Gaza, Israel-Iran, Ukraine-Russia, China-Taiwan. Who knows? So in a 2-year period, quite significant risks on a range of things. Interestingly, the 1,500 global experts that are polled on this have rated for the 10-year challenges. The top 4 are all climatic related. So that's an indication that the real challenge that we face going forward is around climate. That's something that we've got to take into account as well, because as businesses, how is the climatic change going to affect us? As a South African business exporting fruit to the rest of the world, for example, if the water that we're using is unsustainable, if the electricity that we're using to refrigerate that fruit is unsustainable, if we're using massive amounts of fuel in order to export it to the rest of the world that is unsustainable, will our clients around the rest of the world continue to buy from us? So it is very important for us to take these risks into account and build them into the models over the next 10 years. Okay, so those are some of those key risks. And then a couple of other changes that are taking place from a population perspective. First of all is the growth in the population globally. This comes from the United Nations, and you can see the population growth from 1980 through to today. We're sitting on about 8 billion people at the moment, whereas in 1980, 45 years ago, we were sitting on 4.5. So we've nearly doubled the population of the world in the last 45 years. And of course, if you look ahead towards 2050, the UN expects the world's population to top out at about 9.2 billion. So they do believe that the world's population is likely to start to plateau after that period of time. And one of the major reasons for it is development. So the more developed people are, the more developed economies are, the lower the population growth rate is. The other thing is urbanization. And what's happening is that more and more people are moving to cities. So rural activity, rural living is becoming less and less common around the world. And the UN expects that by 2050, about 70% of the world will live in cities and towns, not in rural areas. So if you look at the United States, for example, today, it's over 80% urbanized. People live in cities that don't live on farms. The farms tend to be corporate, massive farms that produce huge amounts of product with very few people living on that land. And the same thing is going to happen and continue to happen around the world. But as people live in cities, I don't know, they have more to do, so they have fewer children. They keep themselves busy in other ways. But they also become a lot more conscious of having to educate those children. They don't have to rely on the children to keep them going in old age, etc. So it's a natural global phenomenon that as your population becomes more urbanized, the population the population growth at least decreases. And if you look at this for Africa, this is another very interesting one. This comes from UNICEF. Africa currently is the fastest growing population in the world. So it was Asia. That's already started to decline. We can see that China, for example, has got negative population growth at the moment. They were sitting at 1.3 billion or so. They're decreasing by several million a year at the moment as more people are dying than are being born. However, in Africa, we see the exact opposite happening. So if you look at Nigeria as the most populous nation in Africa currently, UNICEF expects that it's going to be more than double the size by 2050. So sitting at around 200 million people today, around 450 million by 2050. Similarly, the DRC, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, Uganda, Mozambique, these countries are all going to be more than doubling their populations in the next 30 years. So significant growth. A very interesting anomaly is South Africa. And the key driver of that is our degree of urbanization. So we're currently sitting on around 68% urbanized in South Africa. And by 2030, we'll be around 71% urbanized. So sitting at what the UN is saying the world will be by 2050, South Africa is already there. So as a result, our population growth rate has already stabilized. It stabilized ages ago. The majority of population that we see, the growth that we see, is immigration. And what you can see here, as the rest of Africa has more and more people, that's going to continue. So get used to seeing Africans from other parts of Africa in South Africa, because that's not going anywhere in a hurry, as you can see. Okay. But it's a very interesting thing, because there are actually two of these countries that are the most populous in Africa that have the same thing, South Africa and Algeria. Both of them highly urbanized countries with proper, solid education base, an organized workforce, etc., which leads to a lower population growth. Okay. So those are some of the context issues that we're dealing with today. And that then takes us back into the idea of how can a CEO expect to work within that sort of a context? So what I want to quickly refer you back to that. So once again, we looked at the idea, the sort of common thinking that is that a CEO tends to go through this sort of gentle curve into, less relevance over time. But actually, what it looks like is somewhat different. So our colleagues looked at a couple of major things. The first one was that they looked at a global database of public company CEOs, and they looked at their stats. So there are around 11,000 public company CEOs that have been in operation over the last 20 years. And within our database, through our own assessments and our own succession processes that we do at Spencer Stuart, we've looked at around 4 million, observed around 4 million performance observations among CEOs around the world. The researchers also looked at all of the S&P 500 CEOs from the 21st century. So anybody that was from 2000 onwards, they looked at the performance of those CEOs and how they changed over time. So that was the first point. And then there was also an application of performance analytics, predictive performance analytics, looking at how the direct performance of CEOs changed over time, and did statistical analyses on the performance based on different things. So try and take some of the noise out of why they would have done well or otherwise, rather focus on their own performance rather than external factors, pure luck or pure bad luck. And then we also looked at around 100 ALPs, advanced leadership profiles, from our own succession work of the people within that database, and then did face-to-face interviews with 100 CEOs from Fortune 500 companies. So a significant amount of work going into this. So it wasn't just something that was kind of thumbsucked. That's, I guess, the point that I'm trying to make here. And what came out was that actually, rather than that sort of gentle curve, a CEO tends to go through various stages. They go through the first year, which tends to actually be quite successful. And I'll talk in more detail about each of these stages. Then in the second year, they actually drop. So they rise and then they fall. The second year tends to be quite a bad year for many CEOs. And often what you see is that if the board's in a hurry, they lose patience quite quickly, and CEOs end up getting fired in that second year. In fact, I can think of a couple of banks that spring to mind that have done something similar. And then going into your third to sixth year, you see a period where those CEOs that have made it through these first 2 years start to reinvent themselves, and they start to apply different thinking, different ways of doing things, and you see shareholder returns start to increase through that period. When they get to year 6 or so, they hit what we call the complacency trap, because now you've had this sort of this roller coaster ride that takes you to a point of where it settles down. And often what tends to happen is that the CEO becomes a little bit more relaxed, and things don't work out in any particularly exciting way, and they start to become a lot more complacent, and you see shareholder returns start to drop during years 6 to 10. And then those who have survived long enough to be 10 years plus then actually hit their best times. And that's quite an interesting outcome because, rather than sort of seeing that gentle curve, you've had quite a roller coaster ride to get there. But if you can last 10 years plus, if your CEO can last 10 years plus, you can expect some really solid returns. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But before I go into too much of the detail of each thing, or each stage at least, I want to talk a little bit about how CEOs end up getting to that point in the first place. How do they become CEOs? And there are a couple of things. First of all is that every CEO journey is unique. So not every CEO has done the same thing, gone to the same schools, experienced the same rises, falls, personal challenges, etc. Each one is unique, but of course, as you can see, there are general patterns that apply. The other thing is that there's often the myth of the CEO as a hero, that superhero idea that I talked about earlier. And you see this often with politicians. So I was talking to somebody earlier saying how, talking about the city of Cape Town and how Cape Town seems to be doing particularly well and how many people want to ascribe it to the current mayor and say that, Jordan Hill-Lewis is such a fabulous mayor, that's why Cape Town's doing well. Well, actually, that is falling into that trap of thinking that there is a leader who is a superhero who's making it all happen. Actually, there's a whole machinery behind it that makes things work well. The other is the belief that a CEO is born to lead, and that's not necessarily true. It's really a development process, and I think it's incumbent on boards, particularly, to be looking at people within an organization who have the potential and the possibility to become a CEO, not necessarily just to look for somebody that's born to be a CEO. So you've got to help them build that process. For example, one of the things that many new CEOs struggle with is that they've never been exposed to external issues. So they've been a CFO or they've been a divisional CEO, something like that. They've never had to deal with analysts. They've never had to deal with shareholders. They've never had to integrate with the board. There's a whole range of things that CEOs have to do outside of the organization that someone coming up through the organization has never had exposure to. So you run the risk of them being under tremendous stress in their first year if you don't give them that opportunity. And what that means is that what we should really be looking to do is prepare a slate of people that have the potential, that have been identified as having the potential to be a solid CEO in time, and then look at how you develop those people over time. And that's one of the things that we do as Spencer Stuart is a tremendous amount of CEO succession work, where we work with our clients to identify the people within their organization. It could be 5 people, it could be 10. Some people say that you should even identify 20 to 25 potential successors to the CEO. And that includes people that are a step below the exco, so skip level candidates. Also look at those. Rather than just identifying the CFO and saying this is going to be our next CEO, because then you're putting all your chips on one number on the blackjack table, or on the roulette table at least. Another thing that CEOs or aspiring CEOs need to be doing is spending more time gaining broad experience outside of their comfort zone. So take an engineer and put them in HR, or take an HR person and put them in finance. So get them to have experience across a range of different areas so that they can start to develop themselves and grow, so that when they become CEO, they're much more ready than they would be if you just stuck them in there from a role that they'd been playing for 15, 20 years. Of course, developing people skills is essential for anyone that wants to be a CEO. Things like active listening, things like collaborating. Working in silos when you're the CEO of a group is definitely not going to work. And of course, communicating a vision. That's one of the things that's the most important activity for any CEO to do, is to get people to buy into a vision and to help them understand all of that noise that I talked about on a global scale, painting a picture of what we can do despite all of that noise and getting people behind it. So that people skill element is very, very key. So interestingly, of those people that become CEOs, from our study, we found that between 2000 and 2020, 70% of CEOs were appointed from one of 3 roles. It was either the COO, a divisional CEO, or a CFO. which is interesting. 70% of them have been in one of those three roles before. Interestingly, the ones that do the best are actually the divisional CEOs. And they do well because of the fact that they've had a broad range of exposure and experience. The ones that do worst, and this is something that we as South Africans do need to get our heads around, are the CFOs. Okay? And I think one of the major reasons for it is that they do well in the beginning because they are adept at cutting costs, finding efficiencies, etc. But when it comes to developing a vision, communicating it effectively, collaborating, and understanding all of the different elements of a business, CFOs are not necessarily built to do that, or they're not at least they haven't been given the exposure and the experience to do that. So again, it helps to move people around within the organization, take them out of their comfort zone, get them to experience a range of things so that they can deal with a range of different challenges that they will face once they become CEO. Okay, so what happens in that first year? I mean, first of all, despite everything that I've said, no one is completely prepared to be CEO. The moment you become CEO, you end up with a whole range of things that you didn't expect. So as a board, I think it's incumbent upon the board to understand that this person is going to be learning, they're going to be under a tremendous amount of stress. And one of the things that happens is what our colleagues call the hourglass effect. And that is that the CEO tends to sit in that sort of space between internal and external matters. So, the CEO is going to be asked to go and sit on industry bodies and deal with analysts and shareholders and board and all of that sort of thing. And they're also going from having one boss, which was probably the previous CEO, to having 12 bosses or 10 bosses sitting on the board. So you've got this kind of amount of stuff that goes through them. So that first year can be very stressful. They're dealing with a lot of external stakeholders. And often directors feel that once they've completed the process of succession, their job is done. So we've appointed you, well done, pat on the back, now go and make hay, do your best. And then they take a bit of a break. When actually recognizing the fact that the CEO in that first year is experiencing a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, it should be the board's job to make sure they stay close to that person and they help them to be successful on a sustainable basis. The interesting thing is that one of the reasons why this does well is because it's a honeymoon phase. So markets think, well, there's a new CEO, new brush, sweeps clean, it's going to be fabulous. And the share price starts to go up. Shareholders are happy, the board is happy, they're patting themselves on the back for having appointed such a wonderful CEO. And then, of course, it becomes somewhat overextended. So it can be a little bit exaggerated. And so that's part of that honeymoon phase that kicks in. And of course, it helps that in that first year, you can actually focus on low-hanging fruit. So often you've had a CEO that's been there for quite a significant period of time. They've potentially got stuck in the complacency trap. There have been things that could have been done that weren't done. So coming in as a new CEO, you're able to go after that low-hanging fruit and do the most with it. Another interesting thing that happens in this period of time, of course, though, on the downside, is that often the former CEO ends up on the board. And so we can see this, you can see it in Momentum Metropolitan as an example. So Hilly Meyer, who's the former CEO, now sits on the board. So Jeanette Marais, who's the new CEO, has to deal with Hilly, who had his way of doing things. And, the same thing happened with Woolworths, with Simon Susman. Traditionally, it used to happen with Omnia, where the CEO became the chairman of the board. So it becomes very difficult for the new CEO to do anything different. So that's something just to take into account. But yes, we see a significant increase during that first year because of this honeymoon effect, because of the ability to get a hold of low-hanging fruit and to put new things into place. As you then move into the second year, this is what we call the sophomore trap. This comes from the American education system. They have a 4-year education system. You've got freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and the sophomore is the second year. The sophomore slump is a very common thing amongst academics, amongst university students, for example. Their first year, they work hell of a hard, and then second year, they sort of take a bit of a break and they don't do quite as well as they did in their first year. anyone who's got children at university will probably have experienced the same thing as I have with a third-year university student in the house. What also tends to happen is that boards, markets, shareholders, media start looking at the CEO's performance differently. So in the first year, they were hell of a nice to them. They were all very proud and very happy. Second year, they go, okay, we gave you that first year. Now it's time for you to do things differently. The problem is, of course, that the stuff that they put into place in the first year doesn't necessarily start to bear fruit in the second year. So they would have gone after low-hanging fruit, but to then start to drive top-line growth on a sustainable basis is a lot harder than going after it in the first year. So the second year, you start to see shareholder returns drop because share prices drop, and they, the business doesn't do quite as well. So around 73% of the CEOs in our study did worse in the second year than they did in the first year. So it's a significant number of people that see a drop that takes place. But it's important for then the board to stay close to the CEO. It's important for the board to continue to indicate to the CEO that, we're with you, we can help you, keep asking for help, keep getting out into the field and learning from your colleagues, from your board, etc. And of course, the CEO's job is to continue to communicate a lot. Okay, so then we move into the third period. So they've now the CEO has now been through his up and down, his or her, and then moves into this period of what we call reinvention. And this is when the early moves start to show results. Credibility has now been gained because they've worked their way through this period particularly. The board, the media, the markets, etc., start to believe that the person can actually do it. And so you start to see those shareholder returns grow again. And of course, the lessons learned along the way also enable the CEO to apply new thinking and to start making a little bit more radical moves. So they start to reinvent the way that the business does things, the way that they operate. And they build a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of momentum moving forward. Interestingly, there's not a lot of people that make it through this period. So the sort of 3 to 6 year period, you start to see a drop-off. And a lot of CEOs end up leaving during this period, either because they're asked to leave or because they choose to leave. So of the CEOs in the study, by the end of year 3, 25% had left. And in the end of year 4, it had gone up to 35% had left. So a third of the CEOs had left after 4 years. And then by the end of year 6, around 50% of the CEOs have left. So it's quite interesting to see that half of the CEOs actually leave by this period. So the half that you've got left still have a road to run. So what do we have coming from that? And one of the things that happens is that a CEO and the board together with the CEO need to decide and need to establish whether that CEO is what we call a marathon runner or a sprinter. Is it somebody who's going to do tremendous things here and then walk away and say, okay, it's somebody else's job to now take it and do good things with it? Or is it somebody that's looking to the long term, 10 years, 15 years? And that really comes down to the individual, because not everybody is built to be 10 or 15 years as CEO. Some are sprinters, and that's fine. But you do need to kind of get to the decision as to what that is. So we then move into the fourth phase, which is what we call the complacency trap. And around 2/3 of the database of CEOs that we looked at performed lower during this period than they did in this period. So that tends to be because performance can stagnate as complacency and hubris sets in. So hubris being, I've done incredibly well, the markets think I'm amazing, I've applied all of this new thinking and these innovative ways of doing things, and actually I'm bulletproof. And that then starts to get people to take their foot off the pedal. It gets them to focus on what we call the status quo bias, which is really about keeping things the same, whereas actually out there in the world, as we saw, things are changing. So the more you kind of stick to what you know and you continue to do the things that you've always done, and the world changes around you, you're going to start to see this sort of effect as shareholder returns start to drop. Also, the board challenges the CEO less, because if you think about it, board members tend to be in their roles for around 10 years max. Whereas a CEO who's now been there for 6 years has probably been there longer than about half or more of the board, because many of them have started to cycle off. So the board starts to question that experienced CEO less than if it was a new CEO. And that also adds to that level of complacency. And that CEO needs to continue to get outside views. So don't just refer to yourself and what you did in the first 5 years and think that you must continue doing the same thing. And Koos Becker is a good example of somebody who continued doing this for many, many years. Every year he would take a month and he would travel around the world. He'd go to Harvard, he'd go to Beijing, he would go all over the place to get new ideas and refresh ideas so that he could come back into the business and apply new ways of doing things. And I think that's a very positive way of approaching it, so that you can continue to push for ongoing innovation and try to keep this as minimal as possible, even keep it positive if possible. So that's the complacency trap. And interestingly, many CEOs and many people, many boards have the idea that a CEO shouldn't stick around for longer than 10 years. And that's a bit of a myth, because actually, if you look at it, your 10-year onward period tends to be the most successful of all of the phases. And that's because somebody who has been through, they've kept their energy levels up, they've decided that this is what they're going to do, and they start to develop a purpose and a drive for what their legacy is going to be going forward. And they apply themselves a tremendous amount more. Most CEOs don't last longer than 15 years, so hence the reason that it's sort of 10 to 15 years. And essentially what that individual and what the board together with them needs to decide is, what are you going to do during this period that is going to be your legacy? Why are you here? What are you aiming to achieve? And where can we go with this? And it's really when returns outperform those who left earlier than the 10-year period. There's less volatility in the last 5 years as things settle down and you've got somebody that really knows what they're doing. And of course, early moves that you made in the early stages of this that are longer term start to settle in and take effect over this period. So you can be much more relaxed and drive towards where you're wanting to go during those last 5 years. The challenge, of course, that a CEO and a board working with them have to take into account is that duality between wanting to continue pushing and creating a legacy at the same time as looking as to, I'm going to leave at some point soon, in the next 2 years, 3 years, and what am I doing about finding somebody else that can take over and continue, from a succession perspective, continue the line that I've laid in the sand already. And we can see some CEOs here in South Africa, and I'm not going to name any names, but who seem to never want to go away. That keep promising that they're going to retire and then they don't. And that's that fear of that somebody else is going to take over from me and they're going to mess it up. They're not going to be able to do it as well as I do. So that's something that boards have to take control of and have that conversation with the CEO to say, listen, I mean, you've been here 15 years, 17 years. How long do you think that you're going to be able to keep doing it? Can we please have a proper conversation around succession? And then work with that CEO to prepare for succession in a positive manner and over a long period of time. Because actually what boards tend to do is that during this period, only 3% of the CEOs were asked to leave during that period. So they defer to that CEO during that period. And of course, the board really should be helping the CEO look at what they could be doing during retirement. It's unlikely in many cases that somebody who has been a CEO for 15 years is going to be at that point of their career where they've got more time for a new CEO role. So so you're looking at retirement. What are you doing to help that individual look forward to retirement and make sure that they stay busy during retirement, rather than that fear that they're going to fall off the edge of the earth, no one's ever going to phone them anymore, and of course they're not going to be flying business class and staying in 5-star hotels anymore. So those are those 5 steps, and it teaches us a couple of things as well, some of the myths that come through. The first myth is one I spoke about earlier, which is that CEOs are undaunted heroes who have all the answers. That clearly is not the case. The other myth is that CEOs are fully prepared for the role. And again, not the case. CEOs need to learn before they get in there, and they need to continue learning over time. The third one is that the idea that past performance can predict future success. As we've seen, year 1, fabulous. Year 2, not so great. So past performance in year 1 is not necessarily a predictor of year 2. And then the fourth myth is that new CEOs must prove themselves within the first 90 days. It's a weird, this 100-day thing. 90 days, 100 days. I don't know why we think that everybody must make it within 100 days. But it really is a journey that a CEO needs to go on. And I think from a board's perspective, it's something that all of you can help CEOs to focus on, to work with, and to be successful. And I hope I've left you with some good food for thought and very open to questions. Thank you very much.
All right, do we have questions? If you can raise your hand, we'll get a mic to you. All right, in front, we will start with you.
Thanks, Guy. Question around, I've worked a long time in multinationals, global multinationals, and they tend to assign their senior leaders to 3-year contracts. From the look of your journey and the different stages, you're dooming people to really, really limited success if you only give them 3 years in a place and then move them on somewhere else.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a country that's not their country, and you're on that expat circuit. Would you mind chatting a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Because it seems like a deeply flawed system.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it is flawed, and I think that there are a couple of factors behind it. One is when you're moving somebody to another country, you don't necessarily want to make them feel like they're there for a significant period of time because it affects family, it affects the spouse's role themselves, their own career, etc. And of course, it's expensive. So there's that. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that within multinationals, there's less and less of it actually. So that sort of expat train that was very, very common has become less common. And then, there's also the thinking around, if you spend 3 years here, you'll learn a certain amount, and then you go there and you learn other interesting things. You go there, you learn other interesting things, which is similar to if you stayed within the same place. People tend to be 3 years, 4 years in a role. You don't want to hold people in a role too long because they end up becoming frustrated and potentially then leaving. But it does have another lens to it when you're moving them around the world and you're moving them to different countries. But I would argue that sort of 4 to 5 years is probably, particularly for a CEO of a local organization. I think if you're talking marketing director or CFO or something like that, 3 to 4 years is probably viable. But if you've got somebody running a business, especially a business that is looking to shift and change and grow, you're cutting it short if you're doing 3 years and at a time. I would agree with that.
Thank you so much, Guy. This was a very interesting presentation. My question is on the next wave. You mentioned that there are 3 factors: nanotechnology and biotechnology, of course, and AI. My question is, how far do you think ethics and regulation will drive that wave?
That's a very interesting question, because all of those come with ethical considerations. There's no doubt about it. And I think it's one of the things that is going to have to be changed and worked on from a legal perspective, a governance perspective, and a moral perspective, frankly. And if you look at the previous waves, they went through exactly the same thing. So, electricity, safety around electricity, steam power, the loss of jobs, the whole Luddites movement to smash machines because they were losing jobs, etc. So it's not uncommon that we have issues that, of course, it's going to affect the population significantly. Those people who are going to lose jobs need to be retrained. Hopefully, we can, in fact, retrain them and get them into places where they can work differently. But I think it's a part of society's responsibility to make sure that, we ensure that there's ethics around how things are applied, And that's not always possible to police 100%, but we do need to make sure that laws are in place to make sure that that's kept going. And then we also look at the societal impact of what that, what those technologies do, and how do we improve them. So, for example, if you look at cars, in the early days they were incredibly slow. They were not allowed to go faster than a horse. So, in the very early days of cars, you had to have someone walking ahead of the car, which is a bit bizarre. And now, of course, we can travel at incredible speeds, but we're not allowed to. We're still controlled, so we can do up to 120 or in Europe 130, but you're not allowed to go faster than that. And that's because of safety. So there's a responsibility of government and of society as a whole to control some of the things, and we won't know until it actually happens what those things are going to be that we have to control. So I think legal practitioners, governance practitioners are going to have to stay on top of it and look ahead to see what the possible impacts are going to be from an ethics and a governance perspective, and then keep pushing to make sure that the laws are put in place if they're not already there.
Thank you. Just two questions, Guy. Excuse me. The first one is it not a contradiction in terms from a succession perspective to expect a CEO to stay 15 years? What about high potential and so on? So how do you manage that talent conundrum? Because the organization is going to be blood dry. No one's going to be sticking around for 15 years. That's the first question. The second question, if you project forward as a futures person, is a 15-year cycle not unrealistic in the new world that we're about to head into? Is it not too long a cycle? If the answer is yes, what do you think that cycle would be? Because I would put it to you that it seems fairly unrealistic to expect that organizational behavior and the dynamics of cycles of each firm and so on will sort of respond to changes in such a long period of time. Thank you.
So the first point is an interesting one because organizations do lose good people because they can't see runway. Standard Bank has recently lost a potential future CEO, quite likely because he looked at it and said, how long is this going to be? Yeah. So yes, it is a challenge, but at the same time, from the organization's perspective, the organization needs to decide whether it's better to have that solid, stable CEO taking shareholder returns to where it could be, rather than replacing them with somebody new just because it's time for a change, and then you end up going through those cycles in the early stages. So I'm not sure that anyone is necessarily expected to stay for that period of time, but for somebody that is a marathoner, I'm not sure that you should be discouraging it either, because actually in that latter period, they can really do tremendous things for the organization. And perhaps it is an unfortunate outcome that you're going to lose some good people because they don't see the goal at the end of it. What you do want to do is that you want to make sure that you've got other things for them to do so that they remain engaged and they remain productive so that the organization can do even better. In terms of the period of time and whether the volatility in the world and that volatility becoming faster and faster would be a reason not to let somebody stay longer, will really come down to the individual. If the individual continues to do the same thing for 15 years, completely agree. That person shouldn't actually be CEO for that period of time. But if that is an individual like Koos Becker, for example, at Naspers, who is able to adjust and look and see what's coming, get the organization to pivot, move into Tencent, move away from satellite TV, whatever it happens to be, that individual could do a tremendous amount for the organization based on their experience and their agility. I think somebody without agility who sits there for 15 years, you're going to end up like Kodak.
Thanks. Does your model take age and changing age dynamics into account? Because if you consider where these CEOs find themselves, it's almost like in the northern hemisphere, aging populations, all of that. Now, if you Africanize that and you say, we're going to have young people, we're not going to go through those cycles,
And then how do we overlay that with making that model work for us here?
So in terms of a younger population, whether that younger population or the majority of the population being young necessarily means that the CEO should also be young, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. I think you are going to have more young CEOs than you would have in Europe and the US, for example. But what you want to try to ensure is that they're getting as much exposure as possible so that they get there early enough. In many cases, what happens in Europe and the US, mainly in Europe because they have an aging population, is that it takes much longer for someone to get to a point where they can apply that experience. It's not that they haven't had the experience. It's just that it takes a really long time because there's a whole waiting list of people ahead of them who are older. In Africa, with a younger population, that sort of waiting list of older individuals is not necessarily there. So if you look at it as in a CEO in Europe versus a CEO in Africa, both 40 years old, they've both had experience that would make them ready for a CEO. Luckily, in Africa, they don't necessarily have a whole list of people ahead of them that are blocking them from getting to that position yet. Whereas in Europe, there will be somebody who is 60, even 70, that's got more experience that would be in the way of them getting to that point at that stage of their lives. So I don't think that it necessarily means that it'll be much different. It'll just mean that we'll have young CEOs coming into the CEO role at an earlier stage, but also ready, I believe. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to take into account is that we've got to approach succession very actively, and I don't think we're doing it particularly well in South Africa. So if you look at how many CEOs in their late 60s, 70s have been brought back, some very high-profile public cases of CEOs who are doing a good job, by the way, very good job. Two of them that spring to mind for me are doing a good job of pulling those organizations together and pointing them in the right direction. One in his late 60s and one in his early 70s. But is there really nobody else? And I think the challenge that we've got is that we're not being active enough about ensuring that succession is being done deliberately, identifying those 10, 15, 20 people that could be successors to the current CEO that could step in.
Thanks, Guy. So what's interesting is, if you have been fortunate enough to have a marathon runner, and, like you said, a lot of the board happens to have, been rotated off, so most of the people are new to the board. What would be your advice to the board in creating space for a successor to take over and be as successful as your legacy CEO?
So I think the first thing that a board needs to be aware of is not being directed by a long-standing CEO. And that happens where the CEO understands how all the mechanics work very well, and they're able to direct the board to a large degree. And that's quite dangerous, because then you end up with the CEO being like the king. And so the board needs to be aware of that, and the board needs to have that conversation early on with the CEO around succession. And even if that CEO is going to stay for 15 years, even longer, start the succession conversation from day one. Because then that conversation continues with the board over time. And you have that conversation around, if something happened to you tomorrow, who would be your successor? I think avoiding the succession conversation entirely leads to the problem that you're suggesting comes into place. Whereas if you start that succession conversation, you start identifying, you start developing, 15 years goes by quickly, but that process continues being a rotating process over time. The new board members that come in are aware of it, they're part of the conversation, and so it never actually goes away, and you're always ready if you need to be. Rather than kind of, letting the CEO actually be the chooser of their own successor.
Thanks, Guy. Just want to go back to your future studies and and pick up maybe on an earlier question around the next wave of growth, which is obviously associated with AI and so forth. Just your comments on the existential crisis of human beings. I mean, if you look at the speed of development of artificial intelligence, the robots can pretty much do farming nowadays. There's a whole lot more things that they can do. So where is going to live the humankind in the next 30, 40, 50 years? And also, you've mentioned that people can get retrained into other areas where they can still work and stuff, but maybe that's also region dependent based on the advancement of that particular economy, developed versus emerging and so forth. So can you comment around those 2 points?
Sure.
Thanks.
So I think one of the things that we have to our advantage, actually there are two things. One is creativity. I think human creativity is something that's fairly unique. And the more that we can apply human creativity to what it is to how we live, how we do things, using AI as a tool, that then enables us to keep coming up with new ideas, new things. That's one. And the other is the human connection, the human touch. So will robots replace doctors? Probably not. They could, 100%. But will they? I'm not convinced. Because that human touch is an element. I mean, one of the things that some companies are testing these days is getting a robot to phone you about selling insurance. Oh, it drives me mad. If you want me to put the phone down very quickly, get a robot to phone me and try and sell me insurance. I want to talk to a person, at least, to tell them that I'm not interested. But that human touch, I think, is something that remains and is an advantage for us. Not necessarily because we can do things that artificial intelligence can't, but because we want to have the human touch. That's part of what I think is out there for us. So carers, for example, particularly as certain countries and most countries in the world become more aging, the populations age, we're going to want human beings to look after us rather than robots. So there's a range of those things that I think can be done. I don't think that human beings are at risk of being wiped out. I think that fear has been raised many times before. It was raised with early train travel, for example. So when the trains started going at speeds that went faster than a living being could go, there was a view that we would die because we wouldn't be able to breathe. That was a genuine fear. So there was a whole movement to try and stop trains because we were all going to die. That didn't happen. So I think it's a natural thing for us to fear what we don't know. But I think as we move forward, we will find ways to apply the tools that are coming our way in ways that will benefit us rather than wipe us out. That's my personal view.
Good evening. Thank you for such an insightful presentation. My question is, how are we doing in terms of the numbers where the gender split is concerned? Are we just simply stuck in the it's not broken, let's not fix it? And if the tables had to be turned and going forward we have an en masse of female CEOs, would the graph look different in terms of those cycles? And taking into consideration today the buzzword, mental health, ESG impact, would it, and in a professional opinion, would it look different? Thank you. But I'm more interested in the numbers, and if there hasn't been a shift, why?
Sure. So for a moment I thought you were going to take me down a very dangerous question. Giving opinions on whether women are better CEOs than men. So look, I think one of the things that, and your research would be interesting to see, because one of the things is that I would argue that women and men as CEOs probably lead somewhat differently. Whether that means that the numbers look different in terms of the outcomes, I don't know. I don't think that we looked at that. The reality, though, is that the vast majority of CEOs are men, globally still. And actually more worrying is that those three roles that I talked about, divisional CEO, CFO, and COO, vast majority is men. I think it's something like, is it 13% that are women of those three roles? So it's a really small number that are in the pipeline for CEO. So we do have a problem on that front. And I think that there's quite a lot of research that goes into why do women not move up in the process. And a lot of it is about when the reproductive period is, which is often at the time where people are at a fast growth phase in their career. And that's one theory that comes through, but it's something that we've got to find a way of overcoming. So how do we ensure that the necessary support for women to continue to develop their careers, even if they have child care responsibilities, etc., have to be taken into account. I think it is something that certain countries around the world, so if you look at Norway as an example, they've now specified that 50% of board members have to be women. So I think to a degree, at a legal level, certain things need to be put in place to push companies to ensure that there are more women. And then the support structures that those companies put into place also has to be supportive of the growth of women in their careers, particularly at that period where so many of them step out in order to raise children. But yeah, it's an ongoing problem globally in business and in politics, by the way. I think if we had more women running politics, we'd have fewer wars. But that's my opinion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Guy, for an incisive presentation. As you were deliberating on the factors that lead to the poor performance of the CEO and in those phases that they had to go through, I was a bit compelled to think or to bring something or another layer of factor that I personally think it could be one of the reasons why some of them may be underperforming. And I think the other layer that maybe we must consider here is the issue of human capital development programs within the corporate sector, wherein sometimes you find that within the big companies, learning and development programs are mainly focused on the junior staffs, interns, and tend to exclude the CEO or the big managers and treat them as the Mr. or Ms. Know-it-all. And as a result, then they can't copy with all the macro environmental factors which you have actually indicated in there. So perhaps we may need to undergo some research to kind of look at the role of the HR department in trying to enhance or to support the CEO in terms of generating or the skills that they may need in order to be abreast with all the market and political changes that is taking place within the society. So the direct question is, do you think they are getting the necessary, regular and intensive training which they may need in order to successfully and efficiently run those organizations?
I think it varies from organization to organization. If you look at an organization that in the past has been well known for this sort of thing, SAB as an example, they were well known for making sure that the future leaders are also getting the development. It also came in with that moving people around the world, putting them into different markets, giving them opportunities to develop. But there are other organizations that don't do it exactly as you're suggesting. They do a lot of development at the lower levels, but then they get to a point where they expect leaders to know everything. And the reality is, as we've seen, they're not going to know everything, and they really can't be expected to know everything. So there is a continual process of development that has to take place. And that, for me, comes back to the succession discussion. if you are identifying 20 to 25 people within your organization that have the potential to be a future CEO, what are your development plans for each of those individuals? What are some of the things that they need to do? What are some of the experiences that they need to be exposed to, etc.? And that's a very deliberate process that the HR director needs to work on with the board and the CEO. But it takes the organization to look at succession as something that needs to happen actively over a period of time, rather than when a crisis hits.
Thanks for a great presentation, Guy. I think what I enjoyed the most was that your presentation was factual and data-based. So I just wanted to find out, there's a book that I'm currently reading now. It's a book by Jim Collins, Good to Great, and I think many of us have probably read it or heard about it. But it's also very data-driven and factual. And the data was collected for like over 5 years in that book, and I think yours is quite similar with you interviewing CEOs and so on. So I just wanted to find out, what is your findings from the data on the correlation between the CEO stage versus the company's performance? So I'm not sure what factor you looked at for company performance, whether it was market share or share price, but what were your findings in that regard? Thanks.
So the number that was measured was total shareholder returns. So where you see that up and down amount, that's total shareholder returns, and it's essentially, these are all Fortune 500 listed companies, and so that data is available. Very similar to Jim Collins, he also looked at listed companies because you get access to the data. So yeah, a very similar sort of focus on those kinds of performance factors.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Guy. Very interesting, as everyone has said. Just one question. I mean, the model by the world, was it UNICEF, around the population growth, the demographic shift, it makes an assumption that, of course, there'll be urbanization as it goes, and you went on further to say that we as South Africa should expect a lot more people to come as a result of the factors you mentioned. But what we're seeing, of course, in South Africa is that the economic growth is not growing as fast as the numbers, and the expectation that, or the assumptions rather, that this model makes is that obviously with urbanization, then people will have less children because they'll probably be more economically active and so forth. But that's not the case in South Africa. I mean, as it is right now, we're struggling. So in your view, how do you see this playing out in South Africa? Because I don't think it will follow what has been predicted by the WF in this model of theirs over here. Thanks.
So, first of all, one of the reasons why the rest of Africa has the population growth that it has is because the urbanization in most countries is very low. So if you look at Ghana, it's something like 40%. Kenya is relatively high at about 54%. And across the continent, you have sort of below 50% urbanization. So as a result, most people are still living in rural areas, and the mathematics turn out in the same way as it does everywhere else in the world, where populations in rural areas tend to have more children. So that's happening. What it is driving, partly what it's driving, is economic growth. So you're seeing countries like Nigeria and various others that have higher economic growth than here. But whether that is going to be able to keep up with the significant growth in population becomes debatable. So what tends to then happen is that within a family, there's a discussion to say, you need to move to the city and get a job, or you need to move to a place like South Africa and send back remittances, which has been happening here for decades, long time. Send remittances back because you're working in a currency that is stronger than, say, the Naira or something like that, the Cedi, etc. So there are many reasons why people move, even though our economic growth is low. There are many reasons why people will still continue to come here looking for opportunity. As long as we can continue to experience economic growth, and I certainly hope that we can, that we're not going to sort of flatline for any extended period of time, we will be able to accommodate an additional number of people. What will happen is that if a movement of people into this economy leads to a downturn in the economy, people will stop coming. So it kind of regulates itself. But yeah, there's really very little that countries are able to do these days to stop people from moving. I mean, we can see it, all over the world, that people will move to where they see opportunity. And that's not necessarily only related to the economic growth number. It's also related to the sophistication of the economy and to the strength of the currency and various other factors. So I think as much as, there's a big push to try and get rid of immigration in places like the United States and others, it's like trying to stop the tide from coming in. It's going to continue happening. And it'll continue happening here as well.
Okay, thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. Just wanted to ask, how would the industry sector and the industry life cycle, for example, and any other moderating factors, how will they affect the durations in your cycle? It would seem like the general flow and the nature of the elements in the cycle are quite clear, but the durations themselves, how much flexibility is there in view of other moderating factors like the ones I've mentioned?
So it's interesting because you do have some sectors that move faster than others. And some sectors that are more volatile than others. So if you look at energy or mining, for example, they go through some really serious ups and downs. Whereas others like technology move particularly quickly and shift and change, telcos, etc. But even within those, you'll see that you've got CEOs that last a long time. So, within mining, for example, we have many mining CEOs that have been in role for 10, 15 plus years through all of those cycles that happen within mining. Similarly, within telcos, you've got the CEO of Vodacom who's been there, I actually don't know how long it is now, but it's a substantial period of time. So I don't think that it has a huge impact on the longevity or the success of a CEO, depending on which sector and how volatile or fast-moving that sector is.
More questions.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had a brief question. I was quite intrigued by the first cycles of the CEO. And I kind of wondered if you were able to pick up what kind of support the board gave to those CEOs who were able to get past the first 3 years, 3, 4 to 5 years, versus the ones that actually had their CEOs leave early. Were there any differences in the support from the board? That would be interesting to know.
So I don't have hard data, but certainly, clearly, where a board has been more supportive and stayed close to the CEO, helped them understand, the fact that we're with you for a start, and we're in this for the longer period. We're not going to just bullet you in 6 months. And that does happen. You do see other boards that will fire somebody within less than a year, which I can't quite understand why. I mean, you've really got to mess things up to get fired within the first year. But those boards that are supportive, that stay close to the CEO, that are not just turning up for quarterly meetings and wishing the CEO the best and good luck with it. There's definitely more longevity there because they know that they've got the backing. They know that they can make moves that are potentially risky with the support of the board. But I think it's a two-way process as well. The CEO needs to have the board on their side, and they need to win the board over. So one of the things that the authors of the book talk about quite extensively is the necessity of communicating with the board, with all the members of the board, because you need to have them on your side when times get tough, when you move into that sophomore slump. They need to be there to back you and support you. But also there's a tremendous amount to learn from them. So, use them as a sounding board. And where you see successful CEOs, often they've got a very solid relationship with most of the members of the board. And they're able to ensure that there's not somebody that's agitating for them to get fired within the first year.
Thanks for the presentation. I think for me, it really changed my perspective of the CEO. But as you were taking us through, I really struggled maybe with this idea to say, look, do you think the board is really acquainted with some of these phases that happen in a CEO's life? Because
probably not.
Because it is difficult to oversee something that you're not aware of. And it's almost like, one thing when we get into a board, it's all about, performance. And I'm looking myself as a CEO, I'm almost like tempted to always operate, let's say you're driving, you start the car in gear number 5 or 6, because, you're not so sure what's going to happen. Everything that is in your mind is like, any mistake, I'm going to be fired. And in an interview, like in a recruitment process, and I'm looking at myself pitching, and then I take you guys as a board through that, letting you see that there are those phases. I'm trying to imagine the comfort levels from the board. Are they going to take me seriously and say, because if we start on the same footing like that, I'm sure the journey is going to be smooth and it's going to be a bit relaxed. So I think there's more that we need to do from that perspective, so that at least we almost like travel on the same journey together.
Yeah. So, I think important to note is that one of the reasons why the study was done was to highlight this. So if you look at that common perception that a CEO just kind of, goes straight line, it's a common perception that exists. But by doing the study, we've been able to highlight the fact that we do, as CEOs, we go through phases, and hopefully boards, and we will continue to spread the message, boards will get the message that there are phases that a CEO goes through. They need the support, they need the help, they need the understanding that will enable them to get stronger and to do better. My advice, order a copy of the book on Amazon for each of your board members. That way they'll know.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Join the conversation on X, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube using #ThinkGovernancePodcast.